Hello. Welcome, everyone. We have a few empty seats up here for the folks that are standing in the back. You can not be shy, make your way up. Good afternoon. My name is Maya Ashak. I'm the head of public programs and publications here at David Kordansky Gallery. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's conversation between Naima J, the Vice President of Education and Public Programs at LACMA, Thelma Golden, the Director and Chief Curator at the Studio Museum in Harlem, and Teresa Eggers, David Kordansky Gallery's Director of Institutional Relationships. The conversation takes place on the occasion of Sam Gilliam, The Last 5 Years, which is the exhibition that we're sitting amongst today. This exhibition was a two-part show. The first iteration was at Pace last fall, and so this was a collaborative effort between David Kordansky Gallery and Pace. And we collaborated on this program as well and on a beautiful publication that's at the entrance. We began working with Sam in 2013, and this is our 6th solo exhibition of his work at the gallery, which is really exciting. And as I noted, this is a collaborative program between us and Pace, but we also work really closely with Sam's widow, Annie Gallak, and Jen DePalma, who's Sam's studio manager, and they sort of helped both instill a kind of energy and thoughtfulness and care around how we speak about Sam's work and how we think about Sam's work, and really embraced the gallery space as a place to really honor him, especially in this collection, which was produced in the last few years of his life. And just a couple of kind of housekeeping notes, just to be mindful of kind of the space and the work in the space that we have here, and trying not to get maybe too close to the tondos would be great. And then the exhibition is closing this weekend. It's going to be open until 6 p.m. today, so you're welcome to stick around and chat and linger, and then we'll be open tomorrow as well. So please join me in welcoming Naima J. Keith, Thelma Golden, and Teresa Eggers.
Thank you all for being here today, especially braving the rain at some points. And I'd like to give a big thank you to our fabulous panelists, Thelma Golden, Naima Keith. It's a pleasure and a privilege to share the stage with you today. Before we begin, I'd like to give a short introduction to Sam Gilliam and his transcendent exhibition that we're able to experience together here today. All of the works included in this show were created between 2018 and 2022, the last 5 years of Gilliam's life. Or to put a slightly different perspective on that, these works were created between the ages of 83 and 88. Often a show from this period of an artist's life might be called late paintings, but we didn't feel that the aesthetic connotations of that term applied here at all. Far from fast and loose, these works are ambitious, rigorous, experimental, and progressive. In them, especially in the tondos we see in this room, you see the culmination of 60 plus years of creative exploration. That's what I hope we can scratch the surface of today. The radical, expansive legacy left behind by Sam Gilliam. The true scope of vision and inspiration that's encompassed when we refer to Gilliam as the artist that freed the canvas from the stretcher. So with that, we will dive in. I want to start really big and general here and personal. Can you both tell me a little bit about how you first encountered Sam's work, and maybe how you engaged the work over the years, how it inspired you?
Thank you. First of all, it is such a privilege to be here, to be in this incredible exhibition of Sam's work, to be in this conversation with you all, and to be here with all of you, many friendly faces. Wonderful to be here in LA. So I first came to know Sam's work when I was in college studying art history and African American studies at Smith College in the middle 80s. And at that time, Sam's work was reproduced in many places, but very specifically, the sort of moment that I remember distinctly was in several of the books that had been published at that moment that surveyed African American art. And I saw these images of Sam's work. I graduated in 1987, and in 1989, I had the occasion with two wonderful people, Jackie Bradley and Clarence Otis, who were newly married at the time. Their first child had just been born. He was probably 3 months old. And they were eagerly learning about Sam's work in the hopes of acquiring it. And they invited me to come with them to Washington with their 3-month-old baby to visit Sam in his studio. So in some ways, I almost think that Sam Gilliam Studio is the first artist studio I ever went to. I was a fellow at the Studio Museum just a year after graduation, and we went there, and Sam and Annie Bollock, his wife, his widow, were so amazing and generous. Now, I was the tag-along, right? So, for me, I was just thrilled to be there, but Sam was so generous in his openness to me and my questions, and to the ways in which I think at that moment he understood, perhaps maybe more than I did, what my ambitions were. I remember that day seeing lots of different works. They ended up buying a beautiful painting that's still in their collection. But what stayed with me were that there were some drapes in the studio. So fast forward to 1992 or 3, I was the curator at the Whitney Museum at Philip Morris, which is a small gallery space that the Whitney Museum ran in the lobby of the headquarters of the Philip Morris building, which was across the street from Grand Central. So it was this incredible space. It was free, open to the public, across from Grand Central. Tons of people came in. And it had an atrium that had like 60-foot ceilings. And they had no weight load, so there was never an opportunity to put sculpture. And I wrote to Sam and went to see him and had this vision of what it might mean to install one of his older drapes in that space. Very quickly, the weight load made it not possible, and he did for, at that time, I was probably a 26-year-old curator. He said, I'll make you something. And Sam created this incredible installation, a drape that was a half block long that you could see from the overpass when you're on Park Avenue going by in a car. You could see it street level. He painted it, came to the Whitney on a roll, and then in a cherry picker, he draped it. And it had 2 elements that helped shape it. And I can remember the week that, was like the day the press release had to be done, and this work had no title. And I thought, okay, we're just going to call it Untitled, 1992. And Sam called me, that distinctive Sam voice, and he said, I have a title. And he said, I'm calling this piece Golden Element Inside Gold. And he said, and I'm naming it for you. I mean, this, and I thought about that moment so much in the moment after Sam's passing, because it was the first of many gifts. And, it goes on. Finally, I'll say, is that that's my personal trajectory, but I have been director of the Studio Museum for 20 years. I was curator there before, and Sam's relationship with the museum began in our first year. Sam was part of the community of artists who created the Studio Museum. So that relationship continues and remains.
Amazing, thank you.
I should have gone first. Because no one can tell a story like Thelma Golden. I had the privilege of working for her at the Studio Museum in Harlem, so I'm very familiar with her style. But in my head, so I'll start by saying I'll echo Thelma's thanks to the Kordansky team for inviting us to talk about Sam's work. My story is going to be a little bit shorter in that, but I actually was trying to think of when was that first moment that I encountered Sam's work. And so I asked my mom, who is a dynamic collector here in Los Angeles, Joy Simmons, and I was like, Mom, when did you, I don't say drag me, but when did you bring me, or when did we first kind of encounter Sam's work? And she said, when it was during the 2002 Porter Colloquium. And the James A. Porter Colloquium is an amazing gathering of scholars that happens every year at Howard University. It was started by Dr. Floyd Coleman and named after the African-American art historian, James A. Porter. And I was a junior at that time, and Sam just invited a group of people to go to his studio. And it was also one of my very early studio visits, and that's when it was in college at Spelman where I kind of, developed my own love for art history and my own kind of interest in curatorial. And so going to Sam's studio and really kind of engaging with an artist like that, someone who was like inviting you in, someone's allowing you to ask questions, I think as Thelma pointed out, was just so transformative. But then, kind of once I really delved more deeply into Sam's practice, realizing that we actually had a print at our house that I just never really kind of paid attention to. And so, talking to my mom about it, it was a print that he made to raise money for Xavier University. And so that was actually in our home for many, many years. But it wasn't until, was it 2013, that I curated a permanent collection exhibition at the Studio Museum. And we included a work from the Studio Museum permanent collection. It was called Lions Rock Arc. The Shape Campus, 1981. And it was like the centerpiece of that exhibition. So it was really, as a young curator, being able to interact with the many, many works that were in the collection, but really foreground that work and that become the basis for that one of my early exhibitions was really an important moment for me.
Yeah, which I believe that work was also included in the 82 Gilliam show that Mary Schmidt Campbell curated,
Yeah,
right?
it was the center of that 1982 exhibition. And I think about that work very fondly, not only because it's such an amazing example of Sam's work, but it also is an indicator, of how I think now with nostalgia about our old building, because it's a very big work, and it only fit on one wall of the old Studio Museum, so that it could only be shown when that wall was available because of its size and expanse. And it's there are many images over time from that exhibition that Mary Campbell curated, but through all the many moments when we've shown the collection and given that work place of pride.
But what I loved about including that work, I think, is just hopefully it kind of expanded one's understanding of Sam's practice. I think by that time, so many people had seen the drape paintings, so being able to include something that wasn't that, and to kind of show, again, the long history that Sam had with the Studio Museum was really special, continues to be very special.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to jump into the painting now. So I'll kind of trace the history a little bit for you. So in 62, for people who don't kind of know the Sam Gilliam bio maybe, in 62 is when he moves to DC. The Washington Color School is in full swing at that moment. It's even kind of deep into the history. It's about 10 years deep into that movement at that point. It's the era of Morris Louis, Ken Nolan, Thomas Downing, Howard Maring. And these Washington Color School artists are hugely influential for Sam in that moment. It's really where abstraction kicks off for him. And he makes work in that vein from about 64 to 66. So even though we think of him as coming out of that movement, and he does in a way, it's brief. And it's really a springboard for him and what we come to know of Sam's work. So following that, he begins to make the folded and poured works, which is his first formal innovation. And that's a technique that you see in the watercolors room in the furthest gallery in the West. And it's also a technique that you see used in the Drapes. He begins first. It's actually that formal innovation happens on paper first in 67. He's quickly doing them on the canvases as well. And then the following year, the Drapes. And we could talk a little bit about that process, but it's a really radical departure in that moment from what's happening in Washington and happening anywhere in art. And so I'd love if you could talk a little bit about why that was so radical in that moment, what he was doing with the bevels and the pours and the drapes.
Well, I think Sam was doing many, many things, but most importantly, I think he was deeply considering how to reinvent an idea of what painting was and what it could be. And I think that, his formal innovations, when we look at them now retrospectively, we see at each moment a level at which he is not just experimenting. I mean, clearly they came out of experiments, but there was a certain certainty about these as valid ways to reimagine, right, what a painting could be. So whether the folded and poured works, the bevel canvases, the thinking about scale, because I think that's another thing that comes in that moment, right? This idea that you can go from the smallest works, the drawings, works on paper, to thinking very monumentally. And so all of that, I think, really was the way in which we understand truly what Sam was most significantly inspired by, right? The opportunity to keep rethinking and rethinking again. And I think when we fast forward into this moment, we sort of see in those last 5 years, I feel so much joy in these works, and I feel it's because he was reveling, right, in the possibility that he created, right, in those early works.
Maybe to touch on that, I just want to say that, and thank you for that, the reason that we decided to focus on these years, 2018 to 2022, was that a few important things happened. So the drapes that appear in the gallery over there were all created for the Art Basel Unlimited presentation in 2018. That presentation happened concurrently with Sam's major museum exhibition at the Kunstmuseum Basel, also in 2018, which was focused on 60s and 70s works from Sam. But out of that moment, he's really energized and invigorated. And so what you have in this show is several typologies of work, many of which are not included in this exhibition because we don't have 20 galleries to share with you. But you see some major and new innovations and experimentations. So yeah, I think thinking about him as just an endless experimenter is really, really beautiful.
I totally agree. I think what's great about this show is that you see, like you said, a return, right? Like it's not just about pushing forward and expanding and challenging, but it really is about, how do I keep kind of returning to something and still kind of push myself? I think what you were saying, Thelma, just about, moving through all these different bodies of work, obviously, coming into really challenging what painting can be. But I think also just thinking about how one interacts in the space, right? The scale of them, and just like merely kind of going into the gallery space really kind of forced viewers to interact with his work in a very different way. And I just really appreciate the monumentality of them, it was just like really kind of pushing. And as for an African-American artist at that time to do that, I mean, it wasn't mean that he was the only one, but I just really appreciated that he, working in DC, seeing what other artists were doing and kind of saying like, you know what, I think we can kind of take this 20 steps further. I think that's and I think what we're seeing here is there was never kind of, it wasn't just like I'm leaving something behind. It was this like consistent kind of returning to things and not being afraid to kind of to continue to engage with something that has obviously been a lifelong kind of commitment.
So one of I think what's become an iconic moment in Sam's career when we talk about scale and just really taking up all of the space is Walter Hopps's curated 69 show at the Corcoran with Sam. And I wanted to bring him into this conversation for a few reasons. Obviously, it's a really important and long relationship for Sam, but I think it also creates a really interesting connection to LA. Walter Hopps is a curator that comes from LA, I think could have only come from LA. And he comes to DC in '66, which, not to make a one-to-one connection here, but that's the same year that Sam breaks out of the color school and this era of original innovation begins. Right. So Naima, I want to talk to you about that because you've done a lot of incredible research on especially Black art in LA from the 1960s to 80s. Walter Hopps figures in even into the Now Dig This catalog. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about that moment in LA art history that Hopps was coming from and might have been bringing with him to DC.
Well, so we know, and I'm looking, where's my colleague Stephanie Barron, who's also done amazing work on this period at LACMA, so just want to give a shout out to LACMA. But yes, so, Walter Hopps, famously, he was a visionary and legendary, curator, museum director, really just a great supporter of artists who among many accolades, started a gallery, Ferris Gallery, here in Los Angeles. He then, after establishing Ferris, worked at Keenholz and a number of artists. He also moved to the Pasadena Art Museum. After leaving the Pasadena Art Museum in '66, that's when he moved to DC. But in terms of what's happening here, I mean, you have artists working in assemblage, like Noah Purefoy. You have, like I said, Ed Keenholz working with found objects. And so like you said, not to necessarily make the one-to-one, but, Sam has talked about, because a lot of people have made a lot of that relationship, has talked about how, Hops really did inspire him to go big. Like, he was the one that really, for the Corcoran show, really kind of said, like, what if you took over this entire space? Like, what would it mean? So he talks about, not only kind of encouraging to go big, but also their love of jazz and how, like, the improvisational nature of jazz factored. So they both love John Coltrane. And even though there are moments that Sam would admit, in interviews, that he really liked Miles Davis a little bit more, he also loved John Coltrane. But it's just to say that they shared that love of jazz, they shared that love of, like, experimentation, improvisation. But Walter Hops was seminal in not just showing Sam, but also making sure he got grants, long-term studio space. I mean, he was a huge proponent of Sam's work in DC. I just want to mention, though, that while Walter Hops gave him a major exhibition at the Corcoran, he wasn't the first, that Walter was not the first to give him a major exhibition in DC. Sam Gilliam did have a major show at the Phillips Collection before that, and also had, collector or curators who were supporters, including Kenneth McShine, for example, at MoMA in New York. So it's just to say a lot is made of the relationship between Sam and Walter Hops, but I just want to kind of shout out that there were others that were in Sam's corner in other cities. But Sam really does kind of point to Walter as someone who had introduced him to John Altoon, had spoken to him about a lot of what was happening here in LA. And Sam also showed here in LA very early on at UCLA, at Irvine. So, there was definitely a back and forth dialogue. It wasn't just kind of Walter bringing everything to DC, but Sam was also here in LA in the early days as well.
Thank you. So from there, in this moment of innovation, what comes out of that is the beveled and the folded and poured technique, the beveled edge paintings, the drapes, all of which we see examples of in the gallery. From there, as you said, he has his '67 show at the Phillips, major. He has the Corcoran show, and in '69, he has his first show with Melvin Edwards and William T. Williams, which is another really important lifelong relationship. Mm-hmm. So Thelma, I want to see maybe if you could talk a bit about that show, what you know of that relationship, and also the period that follows that and the changes in the art world.
Yeah, what's so amazing about that moment in that first show is that it really, actualized what was a deep relationship among those three, but also in a wider group of artists, of Black artists, all working in abstraction, many in New York, some here, and Sam, and their deep connection to each other. That was a connection that was about aesthetics, but it was also about a kind of fellowship that they found among each other. And that's something that played out in the way in which they all saw each other as important interlocutors, right? Thinking about, because, we think at that moment, all of them really are the ones who opened the door to understand the different ways in which we could understand artwork. And so, they were big advocates for each other's works, finding new languages, creating new languages to understand the range and possibility of references that went into the work. And those exhibitions, that one and several others that happened in those years, really established, right, a field. But quickly, by, say, about 1974, 1975, right, shifts in the art world made it so that many of those artists were now not showing in the ways that they had before. And in many ways, that's where the story, of the way in which I find such great inspiration in them, because they continued to all work. They continued to think about creating new languages for themselves and for others, and continued to push forward an idea that in many ways envisioned the moment we're in, right? One that would create full context for what they had done. So it was amazing to think of that early show and think of how radical it was, but also fantastic to having seen it resurrected, right? And to be able to have the opportunity to understand the way in which these kind of lifelong artist friendships write some very profound art histories. And that exhibition definitely did that.
Yeah, and I just want to maybe explain a reference in there. You talked about that show being resurrected, and I think you're talking about the 2022 show at Pace
Yes.
with Mel Edwards and William T. Williams, where they come together again and show these works. And importantly, the work that's in the gallery just behind me, and the Carpenter 2, is shown and created. It's created for that exhibition. It's shown in that exhibition, and it is the second in a series of 2. The first of which was created in 1973 and is called And the Carpenter 1. So Sam leaves a note for himself in that title, and it takes him 50 years, but he makes his way back to that work.
Exactly.
But speaking of community, and you know, I was pointing to William T. Williams and Mel Edwards, you know, there were so many artists, as we know, that, you know, Sam was in communication with, right? So thinking about Now Dig This, you know, the premise of that exhibition, you know, and a lot of Kelly's work is about community and thinking about the relationships between artists. And so thinking about other artists like Jack Whitten, or thinking about Virginia Jaramillo, who was in Now Dig This. They were a show in 1971 together at the Manil.
Ed Clark.
I mean, there's so many artists that that Sam was in conversation with, and just kind of think about like how generative that must have been. But like you said, just like the commitment to the work, like despite maybe not showing as much, or maybe not, and also having to deal with you know, how their work was received or not received or discussed, or, you know, all those kinds of things. I think is really interesting.
Well, it was a commitment to themselves,
Yeah.
you know, and I think that's one of the things I learned from Sam. It's about, you know, the ability to commit to oneself and one's ideas and one's ideals, and to continue to make the work with rigor and with a sense of real purpose. And that's who he was through his career, but also spoke about that as an important way in which the work could happen and did happen, in spite of the ways in which, you know, an artistic journey can take, you know, many, many different turns. And I think that, you know, something else Sam also taught me is that as invested as he was in his present day community of artists, he was also very interested in history and legacy. So for example, you know, in our collection at the Studio Museum, we have a beautiful abstract watercolor by Buford Delaney that Sam bought and gave to the museum because he felt deeply and strongly about, in those years in the 80s, before the current moment of resurrection of Buford Delaney, that Buford be remembered for the path that he charted, right? In both abstraction and figuration, but so deeply as an artist, right? Following his heart, following his mind. And so, you know, I think that that's also, you know, part of this story. It's about the sort of the belief and the vision that sort of undergirds, you know, what I think of when I think of Sam's trajectory.
I'm so glad you brought that up. I just very recently learned about that donation, which is incredible. And for sure, I mean, as much as we talk about people like Ken Nolan and Morris Lewis, for sure, for Sam, even before that, there's Alma Thomas and Norman Lewis and these painters that he's looking toward, especially when I think he could have doubted or turned back on abstraction.
But not just African-American artists. I mean, he was very open about, like, Barnett Newman was one of his favorite artists. I mean, I've read that in several interviews. He's talked about, you know, looking at the scale of Monet's works and thinking, and Pollock, and, like, there were so many. So, yeah, just as much as...
Well, Sam was voracious in his thinking and looking at art, you know? I mean, when he and Annie would come to New York, they went and saw everything. You know, he deeply loved thinking about art. He was always eager to talk to me about what younger artists were doing, right? Knowing, you know, seeing what was happening. So I think, you know, you feel that in the work. It comes out of, you know, this sort of deep and careful and curious eye that Sam had.
Yeah, Annie, his wife, widow, she describes him as omnivorous. And I think about how he loved poetry so much and wrote poetry. He was a huge fan of Neruda, as much as he was a fan of Coltrane and Davis and Ornette Coleman. and Tintoretto and Kazimir Malevich. It's really all over the place, the influences. But I love that you brought up his interest in younger artists, because I'd love to shift gears a little bit and flash forward. So in 2001, Thelma, you co-organized the now seminal Freestyle.
With Christine Wycombe.
In the front row. Can you tell us a little bit about some of what you all were exploring, the ideas you were exploring with that show, some of the artists it helped launch that names people will recognize, and how Sam kind of figures in to that story?
You can also pass the mic. Yeah,
I know, right?
I'd like to pass the mic to Christine. I spent a decade as a curator at the Whitney Museum. And I will say, in those years, again, another gift from Sam is that Sam, with many artists of his generation, made me understand, right, what their relationship to institutions had been through the 60s and 70s. They made me understand the ways in which the space that was created for them, they created, right? It was their activism, their involvement that opened up doors. So I understood my life there at the Whitney as being made possible by a generation of artists, art historians, and curators. When I spoke earlier about learning about Sam's work, I feel in this LA room, I have to say that, one of the ways I knew Sam's work were those early books, the few that I had of African American art, and one of them was Samela Lewis's book. So, getting to the Studio Museum in 2000, after a decade at the Whitney, the first thing that felt important for me to do was looking at the Studio Museum's history, was think about how to make an exhibition of emerging artists that would sort of position or create a platform to see and explore the ideas that were inspiring artists at that moment, because that had always been part of the Studio Museum's history, often ahead of, perhaps, where others might have imagined the thinkings and makings of Black artists would be. So that after starting in January, Christine joining in May, we made the process for us to kind of make a show in a year, which ended up being 28 emerging artists of African descent working throughout the US, a range of artists in terms of practice. And what it was meant to do was to kind of open the space, a space that Sam had a lot to do with creating, that talked about the multiple ways in which Black artists could make, right? To sort of move away from the idea that there was a singular, appropriate, accepted practice of Black art. Often in conversations about Sam, there's a kind of false dichotomy that is made between African American artists who work figuratively and African American artists who work abstractly. That was not within the community, right? Because everyone understood the multitude, right? That every artist would be coming to their aesthetic through their own ideas. But with freestyle, the idea was, well, can we talk about this now and talk about the ways in which artists are working? So Christine and I, coming to those 28 artists that range from Julie Moretu, Sanford Bakers, John Bankston.
I know, just speak loudly, but...
Yeah, right. This is half her show.
I appreciate, thank you though. I think also in Frequency was the second one in 2004, something like that. Cedric Huckabee, Shanique Smith, Rodney McMillan. If you think about freeing the canvas from the stretcher, I mean, you see Sam in these kind of ways that...
Mark Bradford.
Exactly.
Okay, sorry. Okay, I'm sorry. Sorry, I'm like excited,
Yeah,
and I'm like in Studio Museum family, we're geeking out, going back to... But I would say even in the... I would say in, I don't want to say all the F shows, but I would say in the F shows you just pointed out, but even the F show that we did, so Thomas Lax, Lauren Haynes, and I did a show for. We included Eric Mack, who I think is like a direct... Yeah. Like he often cites Sam Gilliam. He did a great talk at the DIA talking about like the huge influence of Sam Gilliam. So, I mean, throughout every F show, you could see
Sam's influence. Yeah. And I think it is, yes, an aesthetic influence about, different approaches to abstraction, but also very much about a way of being, right? Sam had a very unique way of being. As I said, he believed deeply, right, in himself and his work. I think it's important, often we talk about Sam in terms of the geography, that he was in D.C., but I think there's a lot to be understood about what it meant for him to be not in the centers of art center, right? That he kind of lived in and around a set of ideas and had a kind of autonomy about that. And I think as we began looking at the F shows, we thought about that. You know, what does it mean to kind of displace a kind of practice from environments, particularly environments, you know, understood around art? And so I think that was there. But also just the idea that, you know, again, I think for me, there is no way I can understand the moment we're in now without understanding the deep and profound way that the generation of artists that Sam was a part of in, you know, just changed the world in many deep and profound ways. You know, I mean, you said it. We were talking about this exhibition the last 5 years, between the time Sam was, you know, 83 and to its end of his life. But, you know, when I met Sam, he was already 60. He had, you know, lived a life, you know, born, you know, in 1933. And so all of what it would mean to live the life that he lived was in the work. And it was the way in which I came to then understand that and know what that meant, and to understand then what it meant to think about new generation of artists and invest them with the same sense of possibility and self that is so embedded in the way in which Sam's life and, you know, always been a touchstone for me.
Thelma Golden, everyone. I think that segues beautifully into what I wanted to talk about next, which is legacy. And both of you work in the museum space as curators, directors, educators. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what it means for you to share these legacies with the public, to educate people on these legacies, to take care of them.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, the work of institution, you know, is the work of stewardship, right? And stewardship is about service. And so in some ways, to be an institution committed to legacy means you are stewarding those legacies for a future. So it's, you know, the kind of work of envisioning. You know, I think that, you know, being the director of an institution, right, and understanding its history and holding its history means also thinking about what it is to make it. So talking about these F shows, we're naming artists. In this room, we have to say freestyle, Rashid Johnson. Rashid's first real museum presentation. Rashid was the youngest in age artist in freestyle. So if a young artist show, you know, that's like, degrees here. A show of young artists, Rashid was the youngest at 22, probably he was. So imagine that as his beginning, and then he moves to, of course, the amazing practice that we know, but understands legacy. So begins to think about, right, who am I as an artist? Who do I want to be? But what also has happened that made that possible? And that's the point at which he begins to embrace literally, right, around the idea of legacy work and this amazing generative relationship with Sam, which, of course, led to a whole artistic conversation, right, between them in those years. And so I think that's also a space of institution building, right? What can happen in not just the ways we collect work, present it, create the scholarship, but also create the space, the living space, for the engagement between artists, cross-generation, so that legacy can be carried and held carefully, right, into our future.
I think, you know, working in the space of education now, so I'm the vice president of... Thinking about legacy building in that capacity, I am always thinking about how we can organize programs, and we were talking a little bit about this earlier around Now Dig This, position artists within a larger conversation and community, right? So not just kind of singular genius, but really thinking about influence, not just for them, but also the influence they have had on younger artists, putting them in communication or putting their work in communication with the work that we have on view. I think just allowing people to not, giving people the insight to not necessarily have anything in vacuum, right? So, not to always kind of shout out Christine all the time, but she's sitting right here. But, just to say, we had a portraiture exhibition that the Barack and Michelle's portraits at LACMA. And I think what was brilliant about what her and Liz Andrews and Christine did is accompany the portraits exhibition with a portraiture show, which allowed the Barack and Michelle's portraits to be seen in a larger context, to understand that portraiture had a long history beyond those two portraits. So people were coming for one thing, but then getting a history basically on something much larger. I think that's our role within education, right, is to constantly be kind of exploring with people that art is not made in isolation, that there's always conversations, inspirations, and Sam was traveling to Paris, he was traveling to all these different places that I think especially for Black artists to remind them, he was he was at the Venice Biennale in the 70s, he was on the cover of Art in America. Like, I think that's our role, is to make sure that it's not just this one body of work, or it's not just, the way in which the work was made, but also, I think, provide this larger context or a larger set of conversations, or to bring people in conversation that could highlight some of those influences or impact.
Thank you so much. So I'm so glad you have your phone there so I can see the time. That's someone who's done this before. So I'll try to kind of wrap this up quickly so that we can leave a little time for questions, if you all are up for that. Okay. So maybe just to kind of close it out, I wanted to ask if there was one thing about Sam as a person or as an artist that you feel like we should remember when we think about him as a revolutionary and as just an important innovator of post-war American art, or maybe something that you feel like people don't understand well enough about Sam. If you could speak to any of that.
Big question. I would say, essentially, it's like, what do people not know about Sam's work?
Yeah. Or what do you think of as his major contribution?
I honestly, I can't necessarily just choose one, but I would say personally, again, as someone who now is really thinking about access and thinking about visitors and thinking about not just experiencing artwork in formal spaces, I am always in awe of his outdoor sculpture. I think not enough people really know a lot about 1975 doing a major outdoor sculpture in Philadelphia, doing a large sculpture at an outdoor park. I mean, I think that there's room for a deeper investigation of his outdoor sculptures, because what I think he was recognizing is that people would pass by, right? Motorists would pass by, people could engage with his work and not necessarily have to go into MoMA or the Corcoran or whatever else, that you could have that kind of interaction and be in awe of his work in many different spaces. So I wish that more people would be aware of his outdoor sculptures. So
Great.
That would be.
Yeah, I think that's an impossible question,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Because there's so many things I don't know, right? And what this moment has meant is, really considering the breadth and the depth of Sam's career, right? And looking at works that we've looked at for a long time and seeing them anew or thinking about them differently. I mean, I felt that way going to see the show in Basel. It was so interesting to see those works that I knew, right, that lived, deep, within, my sense of, iconic bodies of work, and knew them as they related to, Sam's trajectory. But seeing them in that exhibition, they felt, incredibly new and incredibly as if they were just made. So I think that, I wonder a lot about how timeless Sam's work can feel. I think, again, another gift of the moment of that Basel show was not only Sam's health made it possible for him to be there, right? And how amazing that was. Mm-hmm. But I spent an hour walking through that exhibition with David Driscoll. and David then talking about not just Sam and those works, but recalling each exhibition, right? In each moment of seeing them. And, right, do you remember this, David? It just incredible. And I have a picture that I adore with Franklin Sermons and David Driscoll, in front of, one of Sam's drape paintings. And so, think about how much there is still to know. What I've considered, these last 5 years, this work to me encompasses so much joy. Like I feel in a way that, Sam understood what he had done. He really did. And he spent these years, this burst of energy, I feel like this work came, out of spirit, right? Because, at that point in his life to have this incredible sense of strength in practice. But I also think that he was working with, an urgency. But really more than anything, it was with a joy that he got from what it meant to think the ideas that created this work, and they were inspiring him. And so I find this late work really intellectually incredible, but also just so emotionally fulfilling. Right? I feel now, look, let's just talk about all the ways in which we know, right, Sam is still holding us. Did I know this painting was here when I put this on today? That was Sam. That was Sam.
Now he's determining your dressing.
That was Sam, and I feel like embedded, like he's given us so much in these last works that we're going to be looking at them for a long time. And in some ways, that makes it possible for us to kind of stay just in conversation, as I hope to be, with Sam and Sam's work forever.
All right, well, with that, I think we're going to open up to some questions.
Mary versus
Stephanie?
Yeah, Stephanie. Stand up, Stephanie. You can
Oh,
project.
we've got a mic coming to you, even, maybe.
Thank you. I have a question in a way to follow up on Thelma's last comment, is that we often think about artists who have lived a long life, what their that kind of last spurt, that late Titian, late Monet. How would you characterize in a way? Do you see that there is that kind of last sense other than the joy? Do you think trying to look at that last moment? I think about the time between the last time he was here and we had a chance to actually have a conversation in this very gallery with him and what kind of was created after that. Is there anything different that you think in that kind of last phase?
I don't know if I'd say if there's anything different. What it feels to me is that there's a way that he was looking back and looking forward, right? There's a lot here that echoes, right? And you see, many echoes to work from the past, but it's all very entirely new in some ways as well.
I just want to add something to what you're saying, because I think that's quintessential to Sam's work always, like you're saying. And there's this quote from Sam, who did a lot of commencement speeches, as you might imagine, and he always had this really beautiful message for younger artists, which was, don't be embarrassed of your early work, don't be ashamed of it, don't throw anything away, because you're always building a knapsack for the future. And so Sam was always pulling from that. He's always returning to himself. That just, I find so inspiring, so beautiful.
Mary, you had a question? Yell, I don't.
Hi, I'm Mary. Thank you so much. Thank you very much. I actually have a question that's really, really a question. It's not leading or anything. David and Teresa, how did the gallery and Rashid, with this incredible body of work, decide to show the hard edge paintings for Sam's first show here?
You want us?
Mary, why don't you give?
I can. I mean, you can also speak from where you are if you want. I mean, I could.
Hi, everyone.
Mary!
I don't feel like I'm being put on the spot. Rashid, Rashid Johnson, who's one of the gallery's artists, back when we were drinking quite a lot, and when I was courting him to join the gallery around 2008, he began to quiz me on my own particular art history. And one of the artists that we spoke about that evening was Sam. I'm a big jazz guy, and I read Sam's work through the lens of music. And we decided that the first project that we would do together is to go to Washington, D.C. and to visit Sam. And it just so happened that the Hard Edge paintings were hanging in his studio when we got there. And for us, as young people in the world, we knew that this would be chapter one in terms of our relationship that we were creating with this master artist. And so it was really that innocent. We were in the room with this master, and we just knew that we needed to show these paintings. And so that's how it came to be. That's simple. Yeah.
Question right in the middle. Got the Huntington with us.
Hi, thank you so much. Great conversation in the gallery to have this. Hey, Teresa. I was thinking about legacy when you all were talking about that, and the scale of his work. And I'm kind of new in the art world and working at an institution myself, but loved art and studied a little bit on my own, and thinking about the WPA artists and the scale of their work, and wondering if there is a direct influence that you know of from that Sam had from the WPA artists. And also, because I work at the Huntington, and we're doing a show on Sergeant Claude Johnson, when his scale is huge. And then also thinking, like, there's nothing like the WPA anymore, but also thinking, like, what a great service the Studio Museum does for artists. And so all of those things were going on in my head. Don't know if there's a question there, but if you could just comment.
I mean,
Chase, stand up. He has an answer. We're just going to crowdsource this.
I recently did a talk at the Met with Allison Rudnick about art from the 30s, and WPA was an association that a lot of early African-American artists were working and then also being paid to work as an artist. So if you had a proposal saying, I want to open a printmaking studio, you put together your draft, you sent it to the government, and people like, I think Ed Burial, Norman Lewis, while he was still doing figurative work, was involved with the WPA, and there's one printmaker that I think there is a relationship to, thinking about the West Gallery, works on paper, with carborundum and these experimentations that came out of that time, where you had an opportunity to take your practice and ask yourself questions, not just say, how do I keep my lights on and how do I put food in the fridge, but being supported to ask questions, to agitate these thoughts that catalyze your practice, and seeing that happen through these artists at a time where they first had like a moment to navigate their career, not just navigate the 1930s as African Americans. So the carborundum that came out of a lot of that printmaking, which then influenced Robert Blackburn, and these kind of edition works we see now, reminded me of the works on paper. But the WPA, I think, was just a way to get people to work and be supported, and not just work on supporting themselves. Government initiative to believe in artists making work.
Chase Hall, everyone. Thank you so much. Real family affair today. How are we doing on time? Like one more. Okay. Maybe one more.
I'll try to make. I'll try to make this really quick. It's, I think, mostly for you, Thelma. I will confess I'm not quite sure I'm interpreting correctly what you mean by legacy works. Very curious about this topic. Do artists sort of, especially artists who have had a long career, like Sam, do they consider what they want to make as a legacy piece? Who decides what is a legacy work? Who decides? As a museum director, how do you choose?
Yeah.
I'm very curious about this.
Yeah, no, I think I know what you're asking. And I think what I meant, I'm sorry I wasn't clear about legacy work, was not about the specific works of art, but the larger project of making sure that an artist, that their life, their history, their story is known. So for example, the Studio Museum was founded in the late 60s at a point when many museums were not showing the work of Black artists. Maybe they had it in their collection but didn't show it, or they weren't making exhibitions, or making exhibitions and not publishing books, or publishing books and only publishing a few so they go out of print, and therefore we would have artist stories that were lost, right? Important right now. Right, exactly. So the Studio Museum, in a very particular way, has taken on this idea that even if we're not showing an artist at this particular moment, that there's a responsibility to make sure that we are able to continue to present to audiences that artist's work and life, right? And as a larger project, that being legacy work. So whether it's artists from the past that we are saying need to be more known, or artists in the present, right? Where we continue knowing that the art world and the culture world go through phases, you know? I mean, there are moments, you know, when I looked, you know, in preparing for this and thinking, okay, when did Sam have shows at the Studio Museum? Literally, in our 55-year history, basically, at least in some way, every other year, from the time we were founded. Yes, yes. It's a commitment that we make to artists of African descent, rooted in our mission, created out of our founding with the radical premise that you cannot understand the story of art history without understanding and including the genius works of artists of African descent.
This is for Thelma as a little something on the side. I was a juror for the National Endowment for the Arts with Sam in the 90s. And besides all these wonderful GSA, general service, that's what we were going for, there was children's artwork from grammar school. And it was a very wonderful group of jurors who thought, oh, we can't vote on that. And Sam and I were sitting next to one another. I said, we're not leaving this room without voting on something. What kind of a message would we be sending to children, right? And so then we went to lunch, and he said, what do you want to do? And I mean, we were so on top of making sure that children were appreciated. And a year later, or 9 months later, when the awards were given, Jane Seymour was the chair of the endowment, and she couldn't stay, and Hillary Clinton was there to give the awards. And, you know, everybody's standing up and they're going by. But when the children came, she was sitting in a chair so she could look them right in the eye. And I called Sam and I said, guess what? It was just great. He goes, I knew we'd win.
Hi. This isn't a question, but I just want to point out that there were so many galleries in Los Angeles in the 60s that were showing African American artists, and the legacy, you know, I mean, they really carried it on. And also, we did a lot here with kids, too, at Barnstall, the Junior Art Center, and the Watts Towers had great programs. So, I mean, it's sort of from the ground up. And I also want to just, if anybody hasn't read the article in the New Yorker on Thelma.
I think
That's one of the reasons I came today.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I really appreciate that.
One of the things I would say in preparing for this talk that I didn't actually, when you asked the question about things that I didn't know about Sam or the things that people should know, I didn't realize that his wife was actually one of the first reporters for the Washington, black reporters. Dorothy was one of his first wife, was one of the first reporters for the Washington Post, black reporters. And she was really instrumental in making sure that he was like a part of certain dialogues and conversations and marches on Washington. I mean, it was just really interesting, and also in terms of cataloging his work. I was just thinking about that question a little bit more about things I didn't know about Sam necessarily, about his practice, and just thinking about the support system that you have around you, that you're not alone in this. And I just think her contributions and her support of Sam's work, but also her role in the Washington Post, I'm sure played a huge role in his understanding of the political climate as well.
Yeah, I mean, that was the reason that he moved to DC.
Yeah, was her.
Yeah, so one thing leads to the next. And I think just to maybe to speak to what was brought up about Sam's interest in the next generation, and especially in children and youth in the arts, he was a big supporter of arts education for students. That's a big part of his legacy. He worked in schools and taught art to children for many, many years, off and on, starting with high school and university, and then again as visiting artists for a lot of his life. So that was very important to Sam, and is maybe another thing that people don't know enough about. Yeah. With that, I think we will wrap up. Tremendous thank you again to Thelma Golden, Naima J. Thank you all for being here. And I encourage everybody to stick around, look at the artworks, experience them. The show closes tomorrow, so if you know people who have not seen it yet, get them here tomorrow. You won't see these works together for a long time. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much. I knew that was going to happen. That was so incredible.